Hi, my name's Tim Macpherson. I'm publisher of Saltwater Boat Angling, but I'm also director of the Angling Trust. And this is the third in a series of videos that we've made about some of the campaigns the Angling Trust was involved in the marine environment in 2020. And this one's about highly protected marine areas. With me to talk about that is the head of sea angling, David Mitchell. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Tim.
So, in the light of all the campaigns that the Angling Trust has been doing this year, there's another one which has kind of gone under the radar a bit, but actually could have quite big implications for recreational anglers in some areas of the country, and this is highly protected marine areas. What's been going on in this area, and what are the Angling Trust doing to make sure that anglers are not excluded from these areas, if that's an option?
Yeah, so earlier this year the government received a report, an independent report that was written setting out the case for having these highly protected marine areas. And we were working with government before the report was produced to try and provide evidence and to set out the case for why, in principle, highly protected marine areas are a good thing in order to help recover the environment and to recover habitats and species which are, of interest to anglers, of course, but also that in most cases angling and recreational fishing really has a very negligible impact on the environment, and that if you take examples from the US, angling is allowed in most instances in marine protected areas. So we set out our case explaining that. Unfortunately, the report that was produced earlier this year took the line that no extractive or depositional activities would be allowed in HPMAs. And that would include angling, and it would also include catch and release angling, because technically the catching of the fish is a removal and the releasing it again is depositional. So we've been through this before. Some of you might remember the discussions that were had around marine conservation zones in 2009, 2010, idea of reference zones, which would have effectively have been the same thing, no-take zones. Once the report was produced, we made a very strong rebuttal, making the point that angling had been lumped in with all sorts of other extractive activities, such as dredging and things like that, which are of course far more damaging to the environment, and that also angling needs to be looked on a case-by-case basis. You can't just say that it's a damaging activity. It depends on the site, it depends on what's been protected, it depends on the level of the activity. So it all depends on very unique circumstances. Following our rebuttal, we then had regular meetings with DEFRA to discuss the proposals for HPMAs moving forward. And we got to the stage this autumn where we agreed to be involved as a partner in a project looking at international examples of recreational fishing from around the world and how it's managed in other highly protected marine areas. This is with a view to seeing whether it is compatible to have recreational fishing in some circumstances in HPMAs. It's important to note that the Angling Trust the Angling Trust policy is to say that we support the principle of highly protected marine areas, and we really think that people would be very surprised to see just what can recover and what species and what habitats can return to the UK seas if you let it happen. But one of the main reasons for this is commercial overfishing, trawling, scallop dredging, and these kinds of things which really damage seabed habitats, and that for the most part recreational fishing is not a significant contributor to these habitats and species being restored. The other factor, I guess, to take into account is where these things are located. If they turn out to be all very much offshore, it might be much less of a consideration for anglers who, by and large, won't be impacted by them if they're 20, 30 miles offshore, for argument's sake. However, if they're inshore, in coastal areas and heavily populated areas where a lot of people go fishing, then yes, they are likely to have more of an impact. And we know that anglers are very territorial. They fish their local patches. They have a high degree of attachment to them. You know, despite the fact that they might have the rest of the sea to fish in, they become very attached to their local marks where they may have always fished. So, you know, it's very important to people that they don't feel like they're being chucked out of their local patch by having an HPMA imposed on them. So that's another point we've made to government as well, is that it's really important that there's buy-in from the local community for any highly protected marine area, or it's simply not going to work if people don't feel it's fair or that it's been imposed on them without their consent. So we'll continue to work on this next year, but that's really a summary of what we've done over the course of this year to get to this stage.
Okay. A lot of anglers feel that we shouldn't be restricted to catch and release in some of these zones. I mean, I suppose that's going to be inevitable if we're allowed to fish in them. But what about this idea of buffer zones? I mean, this has been talked about, you know, angling circles, I suppose. What does that actually mean, and how is it going to play out when the marine HPMAs are actually designated?
Well, it's actually not 100% clear what's meant by buffer zones, but our proposal for buffer zones and what we would consider to be a buffer zone is an area around an HPMA or around a protected area, a kind of donut, if you like, donut shape, where some less damaging activities would be allowed first, with another sort of lessened level of protection before other activities were allowed outside of that. So you kind of allow the less damaging activities back in an area around the HPMA, and you know they're able to take to benefit from the spillover effect that you get from protected areas, and that's the fish and the shellfish and the abundance in the marine protected area, which makes its way out of the area. Yeah, so that's our proposal for buffer zones within the HPMAs, and we're discussing the idea of this with the government too.
Just briefly at the end here, what about other conservation organisations? Are we going to be at odds with some of them, you know, in terms of what they want? Because presumably some of them are going to, with HPMAs, they're going to want absolutely no activity at all, as you described earlier. Are we working with them?
Yeah, there'll be differing views from different organisations. I think it's fair to say there'd probably be some conservation organisations who said, you know, we don't have a problem with recreational fishing. It's not the cause of the problem. You know, if they can be, if you can bring them on board by allowing them in, and they'll support the HPMA and contribute to monitoring it by being the eyes and ears on the water, then that's a good thing. And there's likely to be other organisations who'll take a much more dogmatic stance and say that no, an HPMA means an HPMA and there should be no activity in it whatsoever. But you need to remember that we're not just talking about fishing. If you're talking about a highly protected marine area where there's no activity disturbing anyone, then that could mean no powerboating, no sailing, no diving, no jet skiing. So everyone is likely to be affected if you have a really, really strict HPMA, depending on exactly what you consider to be disturbance. People going bird watching or seal watching are going to be disturbing those animals to a certain extent. And so at what level do you say, well, there should be no disturbance? So there's likely to be far more people than just angling who are affected by HPMAs. And that's why it's really important that there's consultation with as many people as possible to make sure that whatever is agreed finally, if it's agreed, is supported by the widest possible body of people. Because what's not going to work is an HPMA or anything else which is imposed on a local community by what seem to be a bunch of scientists or civil servants or bureaucrats in an office somewhere who just seem to be pointing at an area on a map and saying, oh, let's just stick it there and see what happens. So it's essential in that instance that people feel like they've been involved, consulted, and are buying in to what's trying to be.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, David. That's very interesting information about what we've been doing this year.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It was good to talk to you. And if anyone wants to know more or find out more information about what we've discussed, everything is available on the Angling Trust website at anglingtrust.net.
Thank you.